Hey all, in this video we are going to be doing a quick review of how to solve proportions. So we already learned this in class, so I'm not going to go into depth in terms of like why we do solve it this way, but just sort of show you some examples to work through. So basically here is a proportion, and when we have a proportion, what we're going to do to solve is we're going to cross multiply, which means that I'm going to multiply the terms that are diagonal from each other. So for instance here, I am going to multiply 12 with 8k. Okay, but there are two sets of terms that are diagonal from each other, right? It's not just the 12 and 8k, there's this other set here, 24 and 36. And so I'm going to put 24 times 36 on the other side of an equal sign. Now that's the really important part here that sometimes people make a mistake with, is they don't put an equal sign in between those two sets of multiplied terms. Okay, make sure you always put that equal sign in the middle. That's the only way you're going to be able to solve. Okay. From here, you're going to go ahead and simplify. So I have a constant being multiplied by a coefficient on the left. I have two constants being multiplied on the right. So I'm going to go ahead and actually perform those operations. When I multiply 12 times 8, I get 96. So that becomes 96k. And on the right, when I multiply 24 times 36, I get 864. Okay. At this point, I have a one-step equation left. I have 96 times k equals 864. Remember, my goal is always to isolate the variable, right? So I want to get k all by itself, so I'm going to have to do something to remove anything surrounding k. There's a 96 being multiplied to k, so I'm going to do the opposite of multiplying, which is dividing, and divide both sides by 96. When I do that, my answer comes out to 9, and that is the answer to my proportion. Okay. Looking through another example here, we'll see something else come up in a second, but we're just going to start by cross multiplying. So first I have m times 9. Okay, and then the other diagonal is 8 times m plus 7. Now when I multiply these, I need to be very, very careful to put m plus 7 into parentheses. So when I say you're multiplying the terms across from each other, I need to multiply that entire quantity times 8. Okay, if I don't put these parentheses here, then I would only be multiplying 8 times m, and that is incorrect. So anytime you see more than one term in either a numerator or a denominator, like you see there, you should know immediately that's going to have to go into parentheses. Now, because that is in parentheses, we're going to have to distribute the 8 to both those terms. So I'm going to rewrite this equation with the 8 distributed. On this left, also m times 9, I'm going to rewrite that as 9m, because that's how we write things in math. And then when I distribute the 8, I'm left with 8m plus 56, because 8 times 7 is 56. Okay. Now you'll notice in this case, I actually have variables on both sides of my equation. And in order to isolate the variable and have it equal to just a number, I'm going to have to get all the variables onto one side. So if you have variables on two sides of the equation, what you're going to do is you're going to find the side that has the smallest number. So for instance, here it would be 8. And you would just subtract that amount from both sides. Right? When you subtract 8m from 8m, that becomes 0, because anything minus itself is 0. So that goes away, and it leaves you with just 56 on the right side. But on the left side here, 9m minus 8m leaves you with just 1m left. So m is equal to 56. Looking at one more similar example, again, I'm going to go through this a little quicker, but again, remember, when I do this cross multiplication, I'm going to have to put x minus 1 in parentheses because there's two terms in that denominator. So I'm going to multiply this out as 4 times x minus 1. And that is equal to 8 times 6. Go ahead and distribute the 4, which gives me 4x minus 4. Okay, and then I'm going to multiply 8 times 6, which gives me 48. Okay. Now I have a two-step equation left. 4x minus 4 equals 48. Now be careful. Remember, as you solve equation, you're working in the reverse or inverse order of operations. So you always approach additions or subtractions first. So I'm going to go ahead and add 4 to both sides. That leaves me with 4x equals 52. And then once I've done that, all I have left is multiplication. So I will divide both sides by 4 in order to isolate x. And that leaves me with x equals 13. Right. Now we are going to get on to another new type of proportion, and these are ones where I solve it. I'm going to have an x squared involved. So I go ahead and I look and I'm like, okay, cross multiplication just like normal. But when I multiply x times x, something different is going to happen. Okay, and anything times itself. Some people get confused. They might think that this is 2x. 2x would be x plus x, right? 2x, x plus x. Jeez, I'm writing so poorly this evening. Sometimes it's bad in class. It's not usually this bad. Okay. 2x is x plus x. Okay. X squared is x times x. Okay. So if I have something times itself that's represented with an exponent, we talked about that a lot right before winter break. So x times x, that is x squared. That's how we would represent it. So I'm going to write this as x squared is equal to 64. Okay. When I go about solving from here, what I'm going to have to do is take the square root of both sides, because right now x is being squared. So to isolate x, I have to do the opposite of squaring, which is taking the square root. The square and the square root cancel each other out. So on the left, I'm left with just x. And on the right, I have to take the square root of 64. And the square root of 64 is 8. Okay. You should know this in your head by now. Be able to do that. If you don't, please use a calculator and please practice memorizing your perfect squares. Okay. And then once I have this though, x equals 8 is not my only answer. Technically, my answer is actually x equals plus or minus 8. And it's very important that we remember to always include a plus or minus anytime we take the square root while solving. And just a reminder as to why that works. Again, we went over this a lot before Christmas break. I have something here. The step before is x squared equals 64. Well, the answer to that was 8 because 8 squared equals 64, right? That's a true statement. But if I were to plug in a negative 8 for x, negative 8 times negative 8 is also positive 64. So since both of those work out in the context of this example, those are both possible answers. And so we write that as x equals plus or minus 8 to indicate that it could either be a positive or a negative 8. If you want to practice, we could also plug negative 8 back in here and see that negative 8 works, right? Instead of x, I just write negative 8. Well, negative 8 over 16 simplifies to negative 1/2, and 4 over negative 8 also simplifies to negative 1/2. So you'll see how plugging in that negative version works out, right? And again, you could plug in the positive answer. And again, you'll see when I plug in positive 8, I end up both of these simplify to 1/2. So 1/2 does in fact equal 1/2. So my answer works out. So again, this is going to happen every single time you take the square root as you solve. So don't forget it. And we'll skip that one. This is the last problem we are going to do. Again, I'm going to go ahead and start by cross multiplying. When I do that, I have 2x times x, right? So again, the 2, there's no other number to multiply the coefficient by, so the coefficient is still 2, but x times x gives me x squared. Okay, and then on the other side of the equation, I have 48 times 6, which comes out to 288. Okay, I know sometimes I'll actually physically write my first step as like 2x times x equals 48 times 6. If that helps you to write it like that, you can, but you don't have to. That's like a step of work you don't really need to show because you're indicating that that's what you're doing when you sort of draw this x in the first step. I'm indicating cross multiplication, so I understand where the numbers here are coming from, so that's fine. But yeah, at this point, I need to keep solving. So sometimes people will look at this problem and they'll say, okay, square root both sides, yada, yada. But I want you to be really careful. Know that you cannot take the square root yet because your x squared isn't isolated. If you were to take the square root right now, you were to try to do this, right? What I would be left with would not be x, and it would not be 2x. What I would be left with would be the square root of 2 times x, and that is literally helping no one. Okay, people like forget if you take the square root of that side that you would also have to be taking the square root of 2. So that does not work out for us. What we're going to do instead is we're going to isolate the x squared term first, right, and make sure that 2 is no longer there. So right now 2 is being multiplied. I'm going to do the opposite, which is divide both sides by 2. And that leaves me with x squared equals 144. Now that x squared is the only thing on the left side, right? I just have something being squared. That's when I can take the square root because it's the opposite of what's already happening there. So I go ahead and I take the square root of both sides. Again, on the left side, the square root and the square cancel each other and leave you with just x. On the right side, I know that the square root of 144 is 12. Again, you should know that in your head if you don't use a calculator, but work on memorizing these. But always, 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 always make sure that when I take the square root of both sides, I am leaving my answer with a plus or minus because I could plug negative 12 or positive 12 in here and both of them would work with the solution. So hopefully that was a helpful reminder as to how to solve proportions. If you have any questions, always feel free to email and ask. Try to do it as much in advance of the quiz as possible. Also remember, if you're watching this before the Go Formative homework, please make sure that you are actually checking your answers. And if it's telling you your answer is wrong, do something about it. Either double check and try to fix something on your own or set up a time to meet, come into office hours. Do something so you're actually learning and preparing for the quiz.